State management is needed by every app. No matter the size of your project, you need to store and do something with all the data present in your app. If you are building something small, you might be able to pull it off with StatefulWidgets. As the difficulty of the project starts to grow though, you have to start looking for more maintainable solutions. The Flutter Bloc package is a reactive and predictable way to manage your app's state, and this package takes everything that's awesome about the block, which stands for Business Logic Component pattern, and puts it into a simple to use library with amazing tooling. And after many months of development, the block package has arrived at its first stable version 1.0.0. Hello, welcome to Reso Coder, where you are getting prepared for real app development by building better, faster, more stable apps. So subscribe and hit the bell if you want to grow your coding skills. Because complex topics such as state management with block are best understood on somewhat real projects, we are going to build a weather search app in this tutorial. The app will consist of two pages. The first one is the weather search page, where we can search for a city, for example, London, and then we can see the details of the city in a weather detail page. So this means you are going to learn how to use the same block throughout multiple routes, which is definitely a good thing to know. And of course, we can search for another city, New York, for example. And there is also a chance that we are going to get an error, in which case it's going to show a snack bar at the bottom. All right, here we go. We finally got an error with the snack bar at the bottom, and also this is how the initial weather search page looks like. This app will have everything that a real app would have, including a repository to manage all of your data from a single point of entry. And as you could see, we are also going to have visually appealing error handling. And because you came here to learn the block library, I definitely do not want to bore you with building mundane Flutter UIs and widgets and all of that. So you can get the starter project with all of the basic widgets implemented. Actually, the starter project will look precisely like this. It will have weather model, weather repository, and all of these pages already implemented. And to get this starter project, be sure to check out the written tutorial from the link in the description, where apart from the starter project, you can also find all of the code written in this video, links to the libraries, and overall go through this lesson at your own pace. Alright, so first, to start out, we are going to, of course, import all of the appropriate packages inside the pubspec.yaml file. We will need to add a dependency to the Flutter Bloc package and also to Equatable. They are both from the same author, Felix Angelov, and they work very well together. Equatable is used for providing simple value equality. The Flutter Bloc version we are going to use is gonna be version 1.0.0, and Equatable is currently at version 0.6.1. While by now I think these packages are totally stable, it still may happen that some future versions will break a certain functionality. So if you want to follow along precisely with this tutorial, make sure that you have the same versions of these packages in your pubspec YAML. Since we have added Equatable and we already have a weather model class, let's go over there and implement that Equatable package, or actually the class which comes from that package. Here you can also see what data will be held inside the weather objects. We simply have city name, temperature Celsius, and temperature Fahrenheit, and temperature Celsius is required, whereas Fahrenheit is not required in the constructor. And because Dart supports only referential equality by default, which means that only two instances which are exactly the same, they point to the same place in memory, only those are equal by default. But we want to have value equality, meaning that even two distinct instances which have the same data will be regarded as equal. And to do that, we have to extend Equatable. which we will import from the equatable package. And now we also need to implement the props property, which, in order to fulfill equatable's specification, needs to output a list containing all of the properties which should be included in the value equality comparison. So those will be city name, temperature Celsius, and temperature Fahrenheit. And with that, we've just implemented value equality in the weather model, which we are going to pass around the app. Of course, we now have the weather model, but how are we going to retrieve the weather? Are we going to use some kind of an API, or what are we going to do? Well, everything important is already implemented inside the weather repository. So if you've downloaded the starter project, you will have this repository already implemented. Let's take a closer look at it so that you can understand what we are doing once we start implementing Bloc. We have an abstract weather repository class, which has two methods, fetch weather and fetch detailed weather. And both of them take in a city name for which the weather should be fetched, of course. And then we have one concrete class, fake weather repository. So we are now going to be reaching out to a remote API. We're going to do everything locally. We are just going to generate fake temperatures. And in the implementation of the fetch weather method, we simply simulate network delay of 1 second, and then we decide based on random boolean whether or not to throw a network error, which is only a simple class network error, nothing fancy there. And then we generate a random Celsius temperature, which we then put into a new instance of the weather model class, which is then returned from this fetch weather method. And we are also caching the temperature Celsius. That's because we are inside a fake weather repository, and we need to have this cached temperature Celsius to use it from the fetch detailed weather, because as you know already from the demo app, if we search for London, the search, or in other words, master page, displays only temperature in Celsius, but the detail page will display temperature also in Fahrenheit. So fetch detailed weather needs to populate the Fahrenheit field of the weather model. And we have this cached temperature Celsius here, which we are going to convert to Fahrenheit using this simple formula times 1.8 plus 32. Cool, that's it for the weather repository. You don't really need to know about its implementation because it has in fact nothing to do with the block itself. You can use any sort of an implementation of the repository, but I think you need to understand what's going on inside the repository, as we are going to be implementing the block, which is going to use the repository and call methods on it. Also, if you want to see a fully fledged app with repositories built with clean architecture and test-driven development, be sure to check out the tutorial series from the card in the corner. Now that you know what's gonna be happening inside the repository implementation, let's talk about the block. Whether you are implementing the block pattern yourself, about which you can check out the tutorial from the card in the corner, or you are using the Flutter Bloc library, as we are doing now, the concept is the same. You can think of a block as if it was a pipe with one input and one output. That's what makes it so powerful and predictable at the same time. And the stuff that goes into the pipe, the proverbial pipe, are events, and then inside the pipe, Bloc determines what to do depending on the incoming event, and then it will output a state. It's precisely inside the block, based on the incoming events, that we are going to decide whether to call fetch weather or whether to call fetch detailed weather, and so on. The way that we can operate with Bloc is that widgets send an event, for example, when a button is clicked. So right now, when we go back and we search for a city, blah, 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 and hit this search button, we're going to trigger an event. Or in other words, to say it more precisely, we are going to add an event to the block. And then the UI will receive a state, which will contain appropriate data, for example, the temperature and the searched for city name, and rebuild itself accordingly to display what it needs to display to the user. So this means that we need at least 3 classes to make the block happen. We need weather event, weather state, and of course weather block. Thankfully, we do not need to create all of these files and classes manually, because block comes with an amazing tooling for developers, whether you are on VS Code or in IntelliJ. So if you are on VS Code, let's go over to the extensions tab and search for block. And you want to install this extension, the first one, which comes from Felix Angelov. And the link to this extension and also to the IntelliJ plugin is also available from the written tutorial. Also, if you want to know which extensions you should definitely have as a Flutter developer on VS Code, check out the tutorial from the card in the corner. With this extension installed, you can now just right-click on the lib folder and select the menu option Block, New Block. Give this block a name, weather, all in lowercase, hit Enter. And now we're going to select that we do want to use equatable, so select yes. This will generate a new folder called block, which will contain 4 files, weather block, weather event, and weather state, and also the barrel file called block.dart, which is just going to export all of the 3 other files, which will allow for easier imports, because we can import just 1 file and not 3 of them. Let's start off with events, because before writing any logic for your app, you need to know about the use cases which the block will support. And since events trigger logic which is executed inside the block, you can really think of events as of use cases of the app or of that particular block. Our app has 2 use cases for the weather block. Those are to get the master weather and also to get the detailed weather. These 2 use cases will be represented as events inside the block pattern. And just for comparison, if you were using something like a change notifier, you would represent these 2 use cases with methods. So really, events are nothing scary, they're just a different way to represent the entry point of data, basically. We want to have the first event to be a class getWeather, which will extend the already generated weather event. And since weather event extends equatable, it also needs to override the props property. And before we do anything with the props, we of course first need to add some property, and every event, including the getWeather, will need to have a city name passed in. So final string, city name. And we're going to populate it inside a constructor. It can be actually a const constructor. So if the argument is the same city name, we're going to reuse the old instance and not just clog up our memory with new instances of basically the same object. And now we're going to pass the city name to be inside the props property of equatable, which will allow for value equality. And now we can just copy this getWeather event and rename it to getDetailledWeather, which is going to take also a city name into its constructor. But the logic which we are going to execute inside the block will be different for getDetailledWeather than for just getWeather. So just to recap, these 2 events will arrive inside the block, which is that proverbial pipe. That block will determine which logic to run, which methods to call on the repository, and then, holding true to the spirit of the block pattern, the data gotten from the repository will be then outputted from the block in a state stream. Actually, I think that it's precisely because of streams and states and all other such things that reactive state management patterns such as block or even Redux on React can be daunting. Streams require you to change the way you think about the flow of data in your app, because we are all used to getting a return value from a method. It's very direct. You call a method and get the value in the same place. However, as you could already see previously on the block diagram, there are no direct return values in the block pattern. Instead, there are states which have to hold everything needed to rebuild the UI, and also the places of adding events and listening to states are separate. Even inside the regular pipe, the water enters on one end and comes out from the other end. It doesn't come out from the same ends, right? The same applies to the proverbial pipe, which we call block. The simplest way to determine how to create states is to ask in how many different states can the UI appear. If you are working with a designer or you've already designed the app yourself, asking this question and most importantly finding an answer to it should be fairly simple. When I hard restarted the demo app, which is already finished, this is the first state. We want to display only the input text field at first, so we can call this an initial state. Then, when the user searches for a city, so some city, and adds an event to the block by hitting this search button, we will at first show the loading indicator, so that's another state, a loading state, and then subsequently we're going to show the actual weather. And of course also an error can happen along the way, as you could see previously, in which case we are going to have a separate error state. And of course inside see details, the states will be pretty similar. We are going to have a loading state and then also a state for when the weather is finally loaded with the Fahrenheit temperature. So therefore, it seems that our app will have 4 distinct states, and all of them will be represented by a class. We already have initial weather state here. We are going to rename it to weather initial. And also let's just provide a constant constructor to this class. And now let's copy this weather initial class and paste it below, name it weather loading, and also rename the constructor. And now we're going to duplicate this class 2 more times actually. And this one will be called weather loaded. And it's going to actually have one property, which will be the weather instance. So we're gonna need to import weather and populate it inside the constructor, and also add it to the props because of equatable, because of value equality. This weather loaded state needs to hold the weather because after all, we need to display the data held inside that weather model object. That is the city and also the temperature Celsius. And in the case of the detail page, we are also going to display temperature Fahrenheit. Finally, we're going to have weather error state, which is going to take in a message. And let's also add it to the constructor and to the props. So now we have 4 distinct states: weather initial, weather loading, weather loaded, and weather error. Alright, so we have the inputs and the outputs of the pipe. So let's finally implement the stuff that's going on inside that pipe. Formally, this part is known as the business logic. And in the case of our weather app, we're going to simply fetch data from the weather repository. So let's go into the weather block class, and to fetch data from the repository, we need to add it as a field of the block. And actually, we are not going to add the fake weather repository directly, but instead only the abstract class weather repository. That's because using an abstract class instead of the implementation of fake weather repository allows us to seamlessly swap between multiple different implementations, and it also comes in handy for testing purposes. Again, you can learn all of this, how to architect your apps and how to test your apps using the block pattern in the Clean Architecture tutorial series available on this channel. So let's add the final weather repository. Call it weather repository and populate it inside the constructor, and let's also import weather repository over here. Every block has to override at least two members. One is the initial state property, which in our case, of course, outputs weather initial. This is what's going to arrive inside the UI layer when the block is first created. And of course, we want to definitely show the initial thing, which is only the input field, like this. Then inside map event to state, we're going to do precisely what it prescribes by its name. We're going to take events, look at their type, and determine which logic to run, and subsequently output states from this method into the stream of weather state. As you can see, map event to state is an asynchronous generator signified by this async asterisk keyword. And I think it's no surprise that block works with streams under the hood, and the way you can output some objects, in this case states, to the stream in Dart is very awesome, because we can use the built-in syntax and use the yield keyword to output a state to the stream. And when any event comes into this method, we definitely at first want to yield the weather loading state, so that we are going to show the circular progress indicator. Now we want to determine which logic we want to run based on the event coming in. So if the event is get weather, we want to try, because remember that the weather repository's implementation can throw a network error. So we're gonna try to get the weather from the repository and store it inside final weather is equal to weather repository dot fetch weather, and we can get the city name from the event. So event.cityname. And now once we have this weather, of course we need to await it. We are going to yield the weather loaded state and pass in the weather. Then whenever the network error happens, so on network error, we are going to yield weather error. And let's just say a nice message in here. You could of course also provide some integer code, which you would then use from the UI layer for translation, but we are building only a simple app without any kind of localizations, so we are going to just output a string directly. Couldn't fetch weather, is the device online? And with that, we have the get weather event handled, and now let's handle even the get detailed weather event. So if event is get detailed weather, now, because we are only making a tutorial app, I hope you will forgive me for creating a bunch of duplicated code, because I'm just going to copy whatever the code is inside the get weather if statement and just change the method called on the weather repository to be fetch detailed weather. Of course, you can separate it out into multiple smaller methods, but I think that we are good considering that we are only building a simple project. So again, whenever an event arrives inside the block, we're gonna immediately yield weather loading state, and then we are gonna determine which event has actually come in, and then call the appropriate fetch weather or fetch detailed weather on the repository. And if everything goes smoothly, there are no errors, we're going to output weather loaded state, which holds the gotten weather. Otherwise, if there is an error, we are going to output the weather error state, holding a message inside of it. Now you know how to implement the events, states, and also the actual block itself. All that's left to do is to use the block from the UI. And the UI of our weather app consists of two pages, search and detail. And the starter project already contains all of the basic building blocks and widgets which are needed to make the UI happen. So for example, inside the weather search page, we have a scaffold with a container, but currently it only always displays build initial input. And of course, we want to change this and display even the weather and loading indicator based on the states coming out of block. So we need to do something about this line, but otherwise we have build initial input, build loading, build column with data, which is going to display the temperature in Celsius and also the see details button and all of that good stuff. And finally, the city input field is a custom widget, which just holds a text field. And whenever we submit a value inside that text field, it's going to arrive inside this method, submit city name, which of course should add an event to the block so that we can initiate fetching the weather, fetched city. So pressing this button, we'll call this submit city name method, which in turn will add an event to the repository. And then we are going to react to the state coming out of the block, not repository, of course, and change the method called to build the UI. And of course, the same stuff applies to the weather detail page. First though, we need to find a way to get the weather block instance to the weather search page. And there are multiple ways to do this. For example, we could create a final field right over here, weather block, and instantiate it right over here equals weather block and all of that stuff. But we are going to follow best practices and start off immediately by providing the block to the weather search page. Actually, you would take a similar approach if you were implementing not block, but for example, change notifier with provider. Because even with a regular provider package and change notifier, you would still need to provide the change notifier down the widget tree. So this is nothing really special to block, but there are some special things when it comes to how you provide blocks, because unlike with change notifier, there is a special block provider widget which is built on top of the regular provider widget. Otherwise, everything stays the same, but instead of typing provider, which actually you can do because block provider is built on top of provider, so you can import provider just fine. But instead of doing this, we are instead going to type in block provider, and we can actually use the snippet which comes with the VS Code extension, so block provider. And inside the builder, we're going to instantiate the block. So in our case, that's going to be the weather block. So let's import block/weather block over to this file. And this needs to take in a weather repository. And of course, we aren't going to instantiate the abstract class because that's even impossible. We're going to instantiate the implementation of the abstract weather repository class, which is the fake weather repository. So let's import that over here as well. Let's import also block provider from the Flutter Bloc package. And the child should be, of course, the weather search page. Now we can use the block from within the weather search page. And to rebuild the UI based on the states which come in from the block, we're going to use a block builder widget. So let's remove this to-do comment and the child will no longer be the build initial input directly. Instead, we're going to specify block builder, and let's specify the types for the block builder. So the block which it should try to get from the block provider is of type weather block, and the states which are outputted from the block are weather states. So now let's import Flutter Bloc. Let's also import the block barrel file. And now, based on the states which come into this builder method, we're going to return appropriate widgets. And notice that these little build methods, which I have already created and which are available in the starter project, are basically matching the states, because we have weather initial state and we have build initial input. We have weather loading state and we also have build loading method. So really implementing the different UIs based on states is very simple if you compartmentalize your methods into these small manageable chunks. So if the state is of type weather initial, we want to return build initial input. Else if state is weather loading, we of course want to return build loading. Otherwise, if state is weather loaded, we want to of course output, so return build and now column with data, which takes in a context and also weather. And where are we going to get this weather from? Well, of course, everything is held inside the state. And since we are smartcasting the state into weather loaded by using this is keyword inside the if statement, we can immediately just call state, which is smartcasted, and get the weather from that state. And finally, otherwise, so else if state is weather error, we want to display a snack bar, but also we want to display the initial input. So let's first handle that. But we also want to display the snack bar, don't we? Well, showing a snack bar is actually a side effect which has nothing to do in a builder method, which actually should be a pure function. As you can see inside the block builder, it writes here, please refer to block listener, so not block builder, but listener, if you want to do anything in response to state changes, such as navigation, showing a dialog, or even showing a snack bar. That's because this builder method should always only return a widget and do nothing else. As soon as you want to do something else, you have to come over to the block listener. The way we can do that is that if we come over to block builder, hit Control dot, at least in VS Code, and say that we want to wrap with a new widget, and the widget's name will be block listener, which also takes in the weather block, or actually we can just copy the type parameters from the block builder. And now inside block listener, we have the listener method, which also provides us with context and state. Very much like the builder method, but unlike builder, listener returns void, whereas builder returns a widget. The reason for this separation between the listener and the builder is actually fairly important. The builder, which builds UI, can be run multiple times, even when the state does not change. The listener, on the other hand, is guaranteed to run only once per state change. And you surely do not want to display multiple error snack bars to the user. You want to only display a single snack bar, and then when Flutter decides for some reason to rebuild the UI once again, even without the state being changed, you just do not want to display the snack bar again and again and again. So that's why we're going to put the snack bar displaying logic into the listener and not into the builder. So let's just check if state is weather error, in which case we are going to get hold of the scaffold, so scaffold of context, and show a snack bar on that. And the snack bar will be simply a very simple snack bar, which will hold the message inside the text widget. And the message, of course, comes from the state.message, because error state, the weather error class, has a message field. And with that, we have just implemented both the block listener and block builder for our weather search page. However, we also need to implement how we are going to trigger the logic inside the block, because currently we are only listening and building depending on the states coming outside of block. But as you know, something also needs to come in to the block to determine which logic to run, and only then we can output a state from the block. And to add events to the block, we're gonna go over to the submit city name method, which, as you know by now, simply receives the city name present inside the text field right here. And we just need to get hold of the weather block, which, since we are using a provider, is very simple. So we're going to store it inside the final weather block and just call block provider dot off, specify the type parameter to be weather block. And that's about it. As of now, we get a lint warning that we should close instances of Dart core sync, but this is a false positive because the stream is actually closed by the weather provider right over in main.dart. The block provider handles everything, including the closing of the streams, so you are not going to get any memory leaks, any such things, but the linter just thinks that we are not closing the instance of the sync, but you can safely ignore this. And hopefully it's gonna get fixed in the future releases of the Dart linter. And now to add the event to the block, we're going to simply call weather block.add and add the get weather event and pass in the city name. Alright, so now we are officially done with the weather search page, but we still have the weather detail page to implement. And there are some tricky bits when it comes to navigating between routes with block. Actually, we can now run this app and not the already finished demo app. So let's do just that. And here we go. So we can enter a city. Let's input London. And of course we need to not hit enter, but hit this search button. Here we are. It works properly. We have London, the temperature, and let's just, for the sake of it, input another city. So ABC maybe. And we're going to see it also. Of course, we haven't yet implemented the details screen, but let's see what's gonna happen. We're going to get just the circular progress indicator. That's because inside the weather detail page, all we are doing is to output a build loading method. In order to not always just build loading, but also to request some actual data by adding the get detailed weather event to the block, we somehow need to get the already present instance of the block over to the weather detail page. And that's the tricky part I was talking about, because when it comes to navigation and block, there are some special things you need to take care of. If we go over to main.dart, here we can see that we are using a block provider to provide the weather block to the weather search page. The issue with this is that as soon as we navigate out of the weather search page, for example, over to the weather detail page, that block, this one, will no longer be accessible in that next page to which we navigate. That's just the way it is. There are two ways we can fix this issue. The first one is to make this weather block be provided globally. We can do that by wrapping the whole material app in the block provider. So it would look something like that the material app would be the child of the block provider, and then this material app would only hold the actual home, which would be the weather search page. Of course, this is not valid code, but you get the point. We would wrap the whole material app in the block provider, and what this would do is that this would make the weather block available globally across all of the routes. But because weather block is not really meant to be available globally, let's imagine that you are building a complex app with 15 routes and not just with 2 routes. You surely do not want to access the weather block from every single route. That would be pretty weird if you had that kind of a need. So the second approach to how to provide the weather block to the weather detail page upon navigation is that we're going to use a named block provider constructor right from the weather search page, just as we are using the navigator to navigate to the weather detail page. Basically, we want to provide the same already existent value which is provided from the main.dart. We want to provide this down to the next route to which we navigate. So we do not want to create a new instance of weather block. We cannot just use this regular block provider constructor because this has a builder, and the builder should always create new instances of blocks. So instead of using this regular constructor of block provider, we're going to use block provider.value, and we are going to simply wrap the weather detail page in this block provider.value. So let's cut it out and let's say block provider.value, and inside of here we need to specify the value, which in this case we're going to get it by using again a block provider. So what is actually going on here? We are using block provider of and specify the weather block. We are using that block provider within block provider.value. Well, if you think about it for a while, what's happening here is actually fairly simple. We are using the block provider still within the weather search page, where the block is perfectly accessible, and we are passing that already existent instance of the weather block over to be the value of the block provider.value constructor. This way, after we also specify the child to be the weather detail page again, with this, what we've done is that the block will now be accessible even inside that weather detail page, and it will be the same block which is provided from main.dart. It will be the same instance. Awesome, so we have the block available from weather detail page. Now what? In contrast with the search page, there is no user input on the detail page. There is no text input field in which the user can input a city name. There is just nothing like that. Instead, the weather detail page is already passed in the master weather, which of course contains the city name already. So if we do something like master weather dot city name, this is available to us. So we want to use this city name value of the master weather field. And of course, to initiate getting the detailed weather, we will also need to add an event to the block. In this case, we are going to add the get detailed weather. So when is the best time to add that event to the block? Obviously, it's best to do it as soon as possible. So we are inside a stateless widget. So what we could do is to use the build method, right? Let's see. We can now access the block using the block provider. So let's import Flutter Bloc over here. And we're going to say block provider off again, specify the type to be weather block. So we need to import everything over here. Let's actually import the barrel file so that we have access to the events as well. And now that we have the instance of the weather block, of course we need to pass in context. Now what we can do is to just add an event, which will be get detailed weather, and pass in the masterweather.cityname. So this is the same city name as is present inside the search page. At least for me, it doesn't feel right because we are doing something in the build method which should not be there. This is a side effect. This does not produce any kind of a visual effect, any kind of a widget. But let's just leave it for now. We are going to come to this later. Let's now finally finish this page by using a block builder, even as here as the child of the container inside a scaffold. So block builder, let's use the code snippet. It will be for weather block and weather state. And as you already know, inside the block builder, we should go over all of the states which can be outputted from the block. So in this case, inside weather detail page, the state can be, so state is weather loading. And in such a case, we are going to simply return build loading. So that's going to be the circle of progress indicator, which you could already see as we were demoing the app. And then the only other state, so else if, is the weather loaded. Because over here we are not going to have weather initial states nor the weather error, because it's just how we've set up the things. If we take a look at the weather repository, we can see that the network error is only outputted from fetch weather and not from fetch detailed weather. So inside fetch detailed weather, we are safe from any errors. Of course, you would not be safe from errors if you were using an actual HTTP package and not just simulating network requests locally. But of course, you have to modify your code to your needs. So back inside weather detail page, whenever there is a weather loaded state arriving inside the block builder, we want to return build column with data and pass in the state.weather over to that method. With that, we can now again run the app, but remember that we are still having the block provider off call inside the build method directly, which is generally not a good thing to do. So let's see why that is. Here we go. We first need to search for a city. Maybe ABC is a good name. Oh, we've got an error here, so let's search for something else. Hopefully now it's not, oh man, now it throws errors. Of course, everywhere is an error because we are basically having a 50-50 chance to have an error. Now we do not have an error, so that's cool. And now when we go over to see the details, we are going to see them in fact, but look what happens when we hot restart the app. Maybe if I move this window a bit to the right, and now, no, you're not going to see it. But anyway, when I now hot restart the app by simply hitting Ctrl and S to save it, and as you know, Flutter is awesome because it supports hot reload. So I do simple hot reload and immediately you can see that it triggers reloading inside the UI. As you can see, when I drag it quickly, you can see that the UI is changing to be build loading, and then it again goes to build column with data. This is happening precisely because this block provider call to add a get detailed weather event is happening every time that the UI is rebuilt. But we do not want to have that. We do not want to initiate getting the detailed weather every single time that the UI is rebuilt. So we cannot just leave this call inside the build method. No, we have to move it somewhere else. And that is not into init state, because from init state you cannot access a block provider, but instead of init state, we're going to move this logic into did change dependencies. Of course, for that, neither for init state nor for did change dependencies, we cannot be inside a stateless widget. So let's convert this widget to be a stateful widget. And with that, we can now just cut out this block provider call to add the event. And inside the did change dependencies method, so did change dependencies, we are going to perform the same call. And what this is going to do is that it's still gonna immediately add the event to the block when this weather detail page is created by navigating to it, but it's not going to call it multiple times when the UI is rebuilt. Oh, but we have build errors, so let's remove this slash. For some reason it's there. Now that it's not there, let's restart the app with all of these changes of the stateful widget instead of stateless widget, and let's see how it works. So if we input a city and search for it, hopefully we're not going to get an error, and we don't, so that's cool. And now when we see the details, we're gonna be presented with the detail page. So the Fahrenheit is definitely here. And now what's important is that when I hot reload the app, you will not see anything. It's just not going to happen. Actually, what I could do is to put a breakpoint over here and breakpoint also into the build method, right? And now when I hot reload, you see that the breakpoint inside the build method gets executed, but the breakpoint inside did change dependencies does not. That's precisely the reason why you should always put some initial data fetching for the block over to the did change dependencies method and not to the build method. In fact, build should really not contain anything else than the building of widgets. Everything else should go to init state, or if you need to access a block provider or some other kind of a provider through inherited widget, you would put that logic into did change dependencies, but never to the build method directly. To go through this tutorial at your own pace once again and to get all of the code, check out the written tutorial available from the link in the description on resocoder.com. Now you know how to use the powerful Flutter Bloc library in your own projects. And unlike other state management patterns, Bloc forces you to do things just one way and the right way. With its one-way data flow using events and states, Bloc is a sure way to bring more structure, extensibility, and most importantly, maintainability to your apps. If you do not want to miss more tutorials like this regarding Flutter Bloc and Flutter architecture and building awesome Flutter apps, definitely subscribe to this channel and also join the notification squad by hitting the bell button to make sure you grow your Flutter skills, because here on ResoCoder, I am determined to provide you with the best app development tutorials and resources out there. If this video helped you with understanding the block pattern and also with using the Flutter Bloc library, give this video a like and also share it with other developers who will surely benefit from it too. Leave a comment if you have anything to say, any suggestions or questions. If you want to get exclusive Flutter news delivered every single week right into your mail inbox, go to resocoder.com and subscribe to my mailing list if you want to grow your Flutter skills, and see you in the next video.